It's my absolute pleasure to have Professor Juliet Floyd here today, who is a professor of philosophy and the director of a Center for Humanities at Boston University. And there's so many awesome things I could say about Dr. Floyd. Particularly, you might know Dr. Floyd's work from the philosophy of logic and mathematics, where she's worked a lot on Wittgenstein, and including some books and some co-authored volumes. And interestingly enough, looking at Dr. Floyd's research and pieces, there's been lots of fellowships that you've gotten over the years, which are phenomenal. And one thing I'll just say on kind of a nice note is you were one of the first people I talked to at this conference, and it was an absolute delight. So I can only say it's going to be great. So I will further ado say that I'm excited to have you come up here and talk to us, and you're going to be talking to us about Langer's dissertation. So how cool is that? Come on up, Dr. Floyd.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Matthew. This has just been a wonderful thing for me to have a Langer circle. Can people hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
I have to. Oh, okay. I have to see my slides or I won't know what to say. So thank you all for organizing this. It's the Langer circle. This is just fantastic. I've been learning all day. So thank you for staying till the end. And I don't have any color or movies on my slides except what you see. This will be study. But I do want to thank my mother, who was the first person to tell me to read Suzanne Langer when I was an undergraduate at Wellesley. She said, Juliet, you're interested in logic and art? You've got to read Langer. And I was like, who is Langer? So then I got to Harvard and took a course on symbolism with Israel Scheffler. No Langer. And then I have to thank Burton Drebin, my teacher, my first husband, who made me his research assistant in the summer of 1985 and asked to go into the Harvard archives. He was writing a piece on Quine's dissertation. And he asked me to read every dissertation written in logic at Harvard from the beginning, 1879, G. Stanley Hall, the guy who brought Freud to Clark, to 1932, when Quine wrote his dissertation. And that's when I read her dissertation. I thought it was by far the best one, till Quine, and I always wanted to work on it. So many things happened in my life preventing me from getting to it, but now I'm going to get to it. So I've been learning all this time. It's great there's a circle. I want to thank all the members of the circle for doing this, and I'm very optimistic she's going to be in the history books. I'm an historian of 20th century philosophy. She's going to be in the books, and so I'm going to write a Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on her. I told the board it's outrageous that you don't have an entry already. So I'm very happy everybody is. We'll bring her back. Okay, so logic to forms of life. I'm a philosopher of logic in part. And my thing is not moving, so why is that? So LAM is logical analysis of meaning. I'm going to start there. And we will look at her dissertation in context. It's a fantastic piece of work. And the work of graduate students is really important. Langer would hate it that I'm talking about this and not her later stuff. I think she wouldn't like, nobody would like to have their dissertation scrutinized. But it's a very important object of analysis because you see a snapshot of a certain time and place, who she was talking to and what she did. And her thesis alone is incredibly important as an historical datum for what was going on in 1926 in logic in the United States. So I will just say it definitely is the best one from many points of view. The readers, Whitehead, Sheffer, and Lewis, it's a remarkable synthesis. She has an annotated bibliography at the end that is just worth reading on its own. She's read everything and she comments, you know, this is not very good. It's just wonderful. The annotated bibliography, vastly underestimated. And so what I want to do is look at these philosophers and traditions through her eyes to see how she inserted herself into that context and help us to see what that context was. So I'm going to read her as part of the American philosophical tradition. The society is supporting us. And I also think, although I'm not a scholar of Langer to the degree many people here are, I think her dissertation contains really the shape of most of her subsequent work. So this doesn't always happen with dissertations, but this will be how I look at it. Okay, so what are the main joints of this thesis? Logical analysis of meaning. Logic as philosophy, I emphasize logic and philosophy are one. It's a universal algebra, a study of all possible forms, patterns, systems, orders, relations. Its universality is not quantificational or notational, but formal. So this she gets from Royce and from Sheffer, and I'm going to explain what this notion of form is. It's idiosyncratic and does depart from the notion of formality that came to dominate by the late 1920s with Quine. Psychology studies the mental, which is the projection and transformation of experience. And I really love, Don, your paper on James. I'm going to argue via looking at Sheffer's dissertation that James actually was close to her early. So the notion of feeling, I think, does come from James. The idea of communicable form, she read German, so her thesis happens to be one of the first ones at Harvard to look at Frege, to look at Husserl, to look at Cassirer. So she had the German. And the communicability of forms is something Sheffer really emphasizes in his dissertation. I'll get there in a little while. And of course, Frege, the communicability of thought. It's social. There are a plurality of points of view. This is in the dissertation. Again, I think it's something that comes from James and Sheffer, and I'll try to explain that as we go. Symbols reflect and express forms without always referring to them as names do to objects. Now, this is a theme of many philosophers of logic at the time. Certainly, Royce, James, Russell, Whitehead, Sheffer, Cassirer, Wittgenstein, all of them would have said, when we talk about a form, we're not talking about an entity that can be named. It plays a different kind of a role. So she's working within this time on that very idea. For her, logical analysis reveals meaning. The shared patterns amongst a plurality of possible interpretations of a phenomenon. It is something open-ended and not exhaustible. And this, I think, comes from Royce, and Randy will tell me how wrong I am about Royce at the end of this, I already know. Whitehead and Sheffer.
Am I not allowed to tell you how wrong you are about Whitehead, too?
You can do that, too. But I've already heard about Royce, so I know that's coming. I'm no expert on Royce. Here she is in the preface. This essay attempts to show that the common element in meaning is the logical form of all meaning situations, and the alogical, notice, the alogical or interpretational elements which enter into every particular case are responsible for the individual character. So we've talked about individuation and difference. This is interesting. There is an alogical aspect to the logical. The course of this analysis has sent me seeking for logic more general even than the formal treatment of propositions exemplified in Principia Mathematica. And this was a theme at Harvard at this time. Royce was the first to bring Principia into the curriculum in the United States. All the students read it, but it was regarded as but one way of looking at logic. The method here advocated is not the study of related propositions or propositional functions. Don was emphasizing this idea in his talk. One way of looking at logic is in terms of sentences and deductive relations. That's only one way of looking at logic as far as she's concerned, and this school is concerned. Not the study of related propositions or propositional functions, but the analysis of systems, disregarding entirely the nature of their elements. So that's the picture of form that we're dealing with. The logical basis of meaning is here defined as correspondence of configuration between systems. Some systems show similarity of logical structure upon comparatively superficial analysis. These, such as three counters representing three objects, are said to stand in a natural meaning relation. In other cases, the analysis must be pressed to further levels of abstractions. Notice there are levels. And it'll be often a matter of finding the right level to expose meaning. Meaning is, therefore, in general, notice symmetric, reversible. And in his dissertation, Sheffer has an argument against Royce. Royce thought he could reduce all relations to symmetric relations. And Sheffer showed that you can't prove the way he did prove it. Once asymmetrical, always asymmetrical was the slogan in Sheffer's thesis. Langer verifies her analysis most amazingly by showing how Couturat's algebra may be multiply interpreted, and here she goes through all the literature. First, propositions, so truth and falsehood. That's one way to interpret the algebra. Ideations, and she uses the terms reality and fantasy to take care of the empiricist structure of knowledge. It's interesting. So fantasy is part of what the empiricist ultimately is talking about from her point of view. Phenomenology, Husserl. And causality, Ogden and Richard's meaning of meaning. And finally, intention and action. So she's going to show how all these philosophical frameworks that are the latest philosophical frameworks of the time can be handled with her framework. So it's remarkably comprehensive and insightful. You learn a lot about Husserl and these figures by reading her representation of them. And here she is very early. Meaning, as it is found in art and religion, has ever been the stumbling block of any precise definition. This, quote, unexplored field suggests a vast complexity and ineffability. Here, I think she has in mind James and Wittgenstein, whom she will argue against in the thesis. But a logical analysis of meaning should reveal the formal aspect of even such higher meanings, and that's an allusion to the Tractatus, where Wittgenstein says there is the higher. And she says, I don't really understand what this metaphor is. But here she'll put it in quotes and work with it, as those of poetry and music, religion, and mythology. And if the word meaning is properly applied to these, a skeleton theory, such as that of corresponding configuration, should cover these higher meaning situations, as well as the lower ones, and I love this part, of simple indication of objects or conveyance of information. So information's like a lower level of meaning for her. But she doesn't believe in this hierarchy. She simply is reiterating the literature. And her note to Cassirer is on that point. There is not space here, she says, for a theory of the arts, nor for an examination of those theories which exist. The reflection upon artistic meaning, that is in the dissertation, is merely sketched to obviate the conceivable charge that our doctrine covers the simple, trivial, but not the higher cases in point. I hope that I've at least suggested the directions in which the present theory of meaning might be elaborated by ambitious phenomenologists, even to the ideal heights suggested by Cassirer, to compile a grammar of the symbolic function as such for language, art, mythology, and religion. So she has the idea in the dissertation. It's basically a programmatic work. As I think Adrian in her book points out very nicely, the interpretation of the Tractatus is a tour de force. So she does not fall into many of the mistakes about the Tractatus that were very common for about 50 years afterwards. She doesn't read it as a piece of logical empiricism. She gets a very different picture out of the picture theory. And among the points that she makes much of, first of all, logical foundations are to be drawn within logic itself. Logic is the most general study of system as such. So you don't go behind it. You have to work within it. This is a kind of logocentrism, which for her involves rejection of the idea of an ineffable something. She draws that distinction between sign and symbol. She extracts that from the Tractatus very nicely and fits it into her own analysis. She's very clear that Wittgenstein's idea of a sentence as a model or a picture is a use idea of meaning. You use language. That's already in the Tractatus. It's not like he came up with that only later. The picture conception as structural modeling, she takes very seriously this idea that every picture has a standpoint, which is a remark in the Tractatus. And she takes that very seriously. She also pulls out and notices the remarks, of course, on music, but also similes, analogies, projections, and Bildhaftigkeit, the modeling capacity of thought and logic. Fairy tales, music, those are in the Tractatus too. She, of course, is a native German speaker. The Tractatus is poetry. So she understands that logic and poetry are one as far as this book is concerned, and she's very moved by this. Logical form also is the possibility of structure. So we were talking earlier about possible meanings and possible spaces. It's not like the picture is like a photograph that tells you what's actually there. A picture pictures a possible situation. So when I teach the Tractatus, I always use the Playmobil people and set up the children's toy and show how I could make this refer to Randy, and this would be Adrian, and then have a picture. She gets that. So it's not a kind of photographic picture, but it's modal. A standpoint is a possible standpoint on a situation, and that's as fundamental as logic gets. You don't study logic to find out what's true, what's actually the case. You study logic to look at the totality of possibility, form. Finally, she remarkably reads this very mysterious remark in the Tractatus. P says P is Wittgenstein's analysis of A believes P. The subject drops out, and you have this P in quotes. Many people think it's a use-mention thing, that Wittgenstein's referring to the language. He's not. The P alludes to some situation of an embodied human being, making gestures or looking at something. And what happens when you attribute a thought or a proposition is you take that whole situation as a picture of a proposition. And so it's a picture of what could possibly be true. She gets that. Very few readers of the Tractatus for many, many years got even close. So it's very impressive. Here she is against mysticism. According to Frege, Russell, and Wittgenstein, significance attaches to anything true or false and to such things only. And I think she's right insofar as logic goes about those three. So that's the claim in bold, and now she's going to argue against it. But the principles involving truth and falsehood defy symbolic expression and mark the essential limits of formalism. I believe she's quoting from Russell there. And Russell had a chaussee distinction. Whitehead told her about the chaussee problem in the Principia. Russell has references to Lewis Carroll's paradox of Achilles and the tortoise with modus ponens, both in Principia and Principles of Mathematics. He argues that logic cannot be completely formalized. Frege, as you may know also, says after a point, I can't tell you what the difference between a concept and an object is. You have to take it with a grain of salt to just jump into the formalism. I can't argue you into the formalism. So she sees this, and she sees that the essential limits of formalism. Wittgenstein's response is, no, logic can be formalized, and then you can't say anything after that. So you have to take as basic the notion of following a rule. It's here, she says, that the essential mysticism comes to light. Truth and falsehood cannot be symbolized, but must be taken as a sort of logical surd, an alogical factor in every system. She says, compare Husserl. Husserl, of course, arguing against formalism in Göttingen. This mysticism finds its heroic expression in the pages of Ludwig Wittgenstein, to which Mr. Russell in the main assents. Here, meaning is taken as something essentially inexpressible. Truth is the unknowable, and all philosophizing becomes a hunting of the snark. So again, Lewis Carroll, she's aware, and she quotes the end of the Tractatus. So she's right on it about what produces that mysticism, and she has a different way out. Now, for Langer, symbols in formal logic are not just strings. This has come up in several talks during our time together. They have significance immediately. They reflect forms, systems through use and interpretation, and not only in systems of propositions. Every string, she argues explicitly, is also a pattern. Logic studies pattern as such. Form is also reinterpretable, and projections of meaning through action and feeling construct analogies via symbolisms. So I can use the Playmobil people to represent the students in the class, or the pen to do Randy and Adrian here. But then I can use you two to represent this. So it's an isomorphism of structure. And she is, I think, working with what she's learned from Russell, Whitehead, Sheffer, the Tractatus, and Cassirer. But the focus on pattern as such is very clear and unwavering. She got there quickly. She never treats the step-by-step recursive aspect of an uninterpreted formalism as foundational, with meaning articulated conventionally within metalanguages. So this would be the Carnapian point of view. This is never her view. She never accepts that view of logic. Now, the Sheffer stroke, which of course she knew about because Sheffer was her undergraduate tutor, the Tractatus, by contrast, constructs the general form of proposition recursively in a step-by-step series of operations. It's very important to Wittgenstein that that's a logical construction. It's always part of Wittgenstein's view that what belongs to the logical is it can be written down in a step-by-step recursive fashion. For him, that's an essential mark of the logical. And she knew, as Sheffer knew, that the Sheffer stroke of joint denial was the basic operation of the Tractatus. Sheffer, by the way, was much more welcoming of the Tractatus than C.I. Lewis. C.I. Lewis, who she does not thank in the acknowledgments. She thanks the other two readers. He was a bit of a xenophobe. He didn't like the Tractatus. And this led to problems for poor Sheffer. We'll discuss those later. In the introduction to the second edition of Principia in 1926, Russell praises Sheffer for minimizing the primitive connectives of logic. So as you may know, the Sheffer stroke can define all the other truth functions in terms of one connective. So you can express and or not, all the Boolean operations. So it looks, and people have laughed at this remark of Russell's because so what? It's a simple exercise you can set for a logic class to do it. So why is Russell thinking this is so important? But of course he's thinking of the Tractatus. It's important that you get logic down to one fundamental operation of negation. Everything that can be said can be negated, and you can produce everything from there. However, Russell, Wittgenstein, and Langer knew that what Sheffer really was doing in his paper, which was 1913, was to demonstrate that the truth functions have the structure of a Boolean algebra. And if you read his paper, that's exactly what it shows. So Russell refers to Sheffer's powerful new method and suggests that Sheffer rewrite all of Principia Mathematica. And what he has in mind is this algebra of logic tradition, which is an American tradition coming from Royce. And Langer's introduction to symbolic logic indeed will show you that it has the structure of Boolean algebra. So that's a result from Sheffer and a way of thinking that she learned from him. Wittgenstein, by the way, did know this. Adrian, it might be for your second edition. Wittgenstein knew what Sheffer was doing. And there are remarks in Middle Wittgenstein about this. He says, Sheffer found not a definition, not some abbreviation, but rather a symbolic system with the necessary multiplicity. And he uses this to talk about aspects and form. We don't see that you can look at it as a Boolean algebra until Sheffer did that work. So this is a very important remark of Wittgenstein's, and he uses Sheffer's, you might say, gestalt aspectual contribution to logic as very central. So this is something Wittgenstein and Langer have in common, that they pull out of the Frege, Russell, and other traditions. When we have a sentence and we put variables in for part of that sentence, what you're doing is you're pulling out aspects of form. And they show themselves. It's like a face looking out at you. So Wittgenstein has this, and Langer has this as well. Okay. Now, unlike Wittgenstein, and like Sheffer and Lewis, she always denied that the mechanical notion of a purely formal operation with signs, for example, substitution. You know, you have a set of variables, a sentence that's part in English and then it has X's. Substitution is the operation of always substituting the same thing in for X. It's a mechanical operation. C.I. Lewis exposes it as very fundamental to this conception. She argues explicitly against this. This is why she bypasses the strand in the history of mathematical logic that made the recursive step-by-step moment of formalisms. I call it a moment. You touch down and you think of a language as a set of strings. It's very important that you have that as a moment, okay? Not necessarily as a metaphysical position. And even Hilbert didn't have it as a metaphysical position. But that moment was absolutely fundamental for getting to the theory of computability, because that had to do with the mechanization of proof, making of an alphabet, a set of strings so you could put it together. You could have a meta-language. You could get the mathematical results. You had to do it. And that's what led to the theory of computability and the mechanization of proof, and importantly, the limitative results of Gödel and Turing that show you, Gödel, Escher, Bach, there is not one system. There is not one machine that can perform all the work of all the other machines according to a single algorithm. The world of algorithms, if you like, is a wild and woolly, robust set. Turing shows you that. The notion of a computable function is absolute. It doesn't depend on which formalism you use, a very Langerian point. That's why you have the universal Turing machine. It's absolute. Gödel said it's a miracle what Turing did. But the price of that is that you have to take the notion of a partially defined function, a function that is not defined everywhere, as the basic general notion. So that the wild and woolly world of algorithms, you can put them together, and in systems biology we see this, but it's very fundamental. There won't be one system of all systems, and you can prove it. But Langer kind of bypassed that because she never really entered into this whole quest to try to analyze the notion of a recursive step-by-step system. So in a way, my reading of her is she returned later to mechanisms in mind. I feel she had to be aware of Turing. It's just impossible. But she didn't worry too much, like Quine did, about use, mention, strings. He was a student of Carnap's. So Quine is the one who brought that tradition to Harvard, extruding meaning from logic, in a sense. Or if you, he didn't want to talk about meaning at all as a fundamental notion. He was somewhat allergic to his background at Harvard. He was also allergic to Carnap's idea that the meaning postulates are the whole ballgame. Quine thought, Carnap, there's no point to this. He and Langer are part of an American tradition in which logic is empirical. You look in the world to find models, then you extract form from that. It's never the hypothetico-deductive method. It's a self-standing method of scientific inference. So even Quine argues against the hypothetico-deductive method explicitly. That's not what science is all about. Science is about understanding. Nevertheless, thanks to Sander Frege, who I directed to go to the Harvard archives and look for Langer, he found something. And when Quine was writing Word and Object, which he took a sort of epistemological turn when his children were growing up. Actually, we have the notebooks. He kept to observe Doug and Margaret as young children. Then he went to Langer, feeling. So in a way, Quine's philosophy of logic in some ways is consonant with hers, both in the continuity of the empirical and the evolutionary picture of logic, and in terms of projection and transformation of experience being absolutely fundamental to the entrance of logic into your world. And also, like Langer, he would have argued against the idea of pre-logical thought. He was very against that idea. You work your way into logic through experience, through particular cases. But anyway, she bypassed that. And you were talking again about Cassirer and structuralism. Again, the background and the history of computability is central. What did Chomsky do? Chomsky says the structural linguists of the time who were working on Native American languages, they make a mistake because they think that you can go into the field and have a decision procedure for generating a dictionary. And he'd studied recursive function theory. Chomsky said there's no decision procedure for that. So that's where the whole structuralist argument went during that generation. Now, I'm now trying to place her kind of looking forward. Where did she fit in this ongoing history of American philosophy? We also have Wittgenstein. And like Langer and Sheffer and Lewis, Wittgenstein rejected Viennese positivism, and certainly the scientism, Wittgenstein gave the lecture on ethics in 1929 at Cambridge as a public lecture to distance himself from the Vienna Circle. He didn't want to be regarded as a scientific philosopher. William James was very important to Wittgenstein. Varieties of Religious Experience really saved him in 1912. So the idea, if you think about the literary format of Varieties of Religious Experience, it's all first-person anecdotes. It's not James telling you what they're saying. He lets people speak for themselves. So Wittgenstein's idea that ethics is a first-person subject, it's about individuation. This he loved about James. And you can see pieces of James' Varieties echoes in the Tractatus that I'm sure she would have recognized. Langer would have definitely recognized. But unlike her, he took formalism very seriously. So he was back in Vienna. He had to think about Hilbert and Gödel, what's going on with this mechanization of proof. And even though he always argued that metamathematics is just more mathematics, it's not like you have some neutral position with these formalisms, it took him a really long time to get through this jungle, because it was a jungle. One of the things Turing did that's most important is there were all these jungles of logical formalisms around. And Turing, influenced by Wittgenstein, according to me, but I have pretty good arguments for that, Turing just makes it a language game. The important point, it's not a miracle like Gödel thought. Turing made the little step-by-step image of a person with a pencil acting mechanically. He made that the basic notion. And because to analyze what the notion of a formal system is, you can't just write down another formalism. You have to do something philosophical. You have to change the model, the symbolism. So that's what Turing did. So that's why I really want to find out if she read Turing. Anyway, 1933-37, Wittgenstein was doing all kinds of things to try to get through this. And it's very important that finally in 37, after reading Turing, after getting to the notion of a language game, he finally gets to the form of life basis of the concept of following a rule. So at that point, it's interesting. She sort of evaded that whole working through the jungle, but in a funny way, they end up in a not dissimilar place. It's about forms of life. And the world we live in is a world of rapidly evolving embeddings of words in forms of life. And that notion of form is a logical notion. So my picture is they kind of get to the same place, but by different routes. Just to go a little further with this, Wittgenstein did also make a kind of anthropological turn. She mentions anthropology in the dissertation as well, of course. He, of course, is very critical of Sir James Frazer. He thinks Frazer is the savage Englishman who goes and tells us about these poor primitive people who do bad science. Wittgenstein's livid about that. But it came after Langer's turn. She was already talking about anthropology in the dissertation. And I do want to say, after Leslie's talk, which I thought was fabulously interesting, she is more optimistic in her generation, like Quine. Wittgenstein is very different. That cultural pessimism, the whole idea that the modern press manufactures bad thinking. Wittgenstein was much more a person in the 20s who took all that stuff in Spengler about the decline of the West very seriously. So, of course, did others in the Vienna Circle. So Quine's motto in Word of an Object is, we're on this boat at sea. He takes it from Neurath. We're repairing the boat of knowledge at sea, and we can never dry dock. That's from the anti-Spengler essay of Neurath. So she doesn't have that. Quine doesn't have that. It's a much more optimistic American tradition, reflecting America's rise to basically being a world power. So I think that is worth remarking. In 1937, what Wittgenstein does, in my view, after reading Turing, he eliminates the word Kultur from the manuscript of Philosophical Investigations. Now, of course, the Nazis have ruined it by 1937. It's very terrible, so he takes it out. But he substitutes forms of life for the word Kultur. And after that, he only uses forms of life. It's a much more Langerian idea about the origins of culture. And it's better because the word culture, although she still uses it, it's kind of too high up. It kind of implies that high-low business, especially the word Kultur. So forms of life and living forms is much better. Again, they get to the same place. And by the word Kultur does not appear in philosophical investigations. That's no accident. None. So it's like a regression of logic down to what we have, which is forms of life. And form is the possibility of structure. It doesn't mean that you have it. So I think metaphorically the point in the investigations is the camps are opened, it's 1945. I don't know if there's going to be culture. What there will be is forms of life, and you'll have to work with that, which is kind of where we live now with AI, I'm afraid. Now, 1941 is Philosophy in a New Key. This is public philosophy. You know, she had the temerity to write a best-selling book. And I don't know, as a result, she was written out of academic philosophy. I really want to know if Wittgenstein read this. I mean, there's this myth he didn't read anything. It's not true. He was reading stuff. You're telling me Elizabeth Anscombe didn't know about Langer? So I hope we can do some work at Oxford. Maybe Yiddish, you can help. I want to know. 53, Feeling and Form comes out. Again, philosophy of art, organic forms, public philosophy. Same year as the investigations. So again, what's going on with 1953? And then she, of course, has this wonderful long life. So she's able to go on to do Mind, an essay on human feeling. Wittgenstein dies before he can get very far with it, but the whole of part 2 of the investigations is about the Gestalt, the duck rabbit, symbolization, mind, mentality as part of that. So it's sort of like she was able to keep going longer, learn the biology. But forms of life, of course, has this ethological and biological aspect to it. I'm running out of time terribly. Okay, I'm not going to stay. Okay, now we have to get to the Harvard School. And I'll have to go quickly because I've been talking 35 minutes. Harvard begins to be a kind of international research place only around 1879. Before then, like Royce got his PhD in Germany. Johns Hopkins had the first PhD programs. First PhD in philosophy at Harvard wasn't until 1879, as I say. So Langer is writing her dissertation consolidating the work that has been done at Harvard during these first decades, particularly in logic. And I think that's how you have to see what she's doing there, in part. You have Huntington in the math department. This is a very algebraical school. They use the word postulate instead of axiom. And you can see Quine using that word too, and Lewis. Postulate doesn't carry the connotation of being self-evidently true. Axiom does. They don't like that. It's not, you're going to be pluralistic. You're not going to say anything self-evident. And Huntington, of course, was on Sheffer's committee. And philosophy and psychology were the same department until 1934, 36. So half the dissertations I looked at were measurements of rats doing various things. Logocentrism is a theme, though. Royce, Peirce, Whitehead. The generality of logic lies in its treating systems, forms as such. And the basic idea is invariance of form under reinterpretation. It's not quantificational generality. For example, Dedekind is a hero for Royce. Dedekind just starts with the notion of a system. You've got actually infinite objects now in mathematics, so you can just postulate this stuff. Principia is important, but not fundamental. And many dissertations compare Principia with the algebra of logic approach. So again, Langer's dissertation is part of a longer history of many other dissertations. It's just much better than most of them philosophically. Norbert Wiener's thesis was doing this, comparing the algebra of logic tradition with the other forms of logic. Now, the idea of a Boolean algebra was drawn in Sheffer's 1908 dissertation. He spelled it with an I, B-O-O-L-I-A-N. It's kind of strange. Anyway. As for dates, I think we should think about how Langer fits. So 1898 to 1910, which is when James dies, we have this so-called golden age of Royce and Peirce, logic, psychology. Sheffer's dissertation is 1908, C.I. Lewis's is 1910. Russell visits in 1914 after James's death. He hates it. He thinks it's a totally anti-Semitic place. He can't stand it. He doesn't like how they're treating Sheffer. So he does not stay. They try to recruit him. Royce dies in 1916, and so Sheffer was brought to Harvard in 1917 in order to put the papers of Peirce and the papers of Royce together. What an impossible job, the poor guy. It's a completely anti-Semitic place. He's a completely, he's like an adjunct. He's supposed to take care of editing all of Peirce, all of Royce, and rewrite Principia Mathematica and do all the teaching of logic. He had a terrible life, and Suzanne Langer was very loyal to him. She saw how badly he had been treated, and he had taught her a lot. So 1916, he started teaching her. He was a young instructor who had just inherited this mess. And Sheffer was teacher. Then C.I. Lewis gets to come in 1920 to Harvard after having been la-di-da over in the West Coast at Berkeley, writing Survey of Symbolic Logic, this very important textbook. So things went very smoothly for Sheffer. It was a different situation. 21, 22 in Vienna. Then, of course, these other things. Everybody knows that here. Here's the part where Randy's going to say I'm wrong, I guess. I don't know. So now I just want to look at a few of the roots, and then I'll stop. For Royce, reality is an infinitely complex, actually infinite complex, universe of signs unfolding in the process of being interpreted by an infinite or potentially infinite community of minds. The universal community evolves, guided by a shared spirit of truth-seeking. It is itself a sign.
Still okay.
Oh, God. Thank you, Randy. Truth is absolute and, quote, beyond human opinions, ideas, and the effort of a live creature to adapt himself to his natural world.
Well, he said it, didn't he?
Thank you. Again, logic is the most general study of all the various types of order and relation, a Langerian theme. Okay, here's the part you won't like, I think. It reflects, for Royce, an absolute framework for all possible sets of rational acts of will.
Wrong.
Okay, sorry, so this is wrong.
The word
so-
possible is the only one you have to take back.
All sets of rational acts of will, okay.
There you go.
Okay, so the point is that the notion of a rational action is basic to his conception of logic.
Yep.
And Sheffer and Lewis say no.
And they both read it wrong. But anyway.
Okay, but Langer inherits from Sheffer
That's right.
the project of getting the idea of a rational will out of logic as a primitive notion. So her notion of meaning is very different.
It isn't in logic for Royce, but go ahead.
Insofar as logic studies the laws of thought, it studies the necessary laws of all possible thought, all will acts. Now, okay, so we can just, that's all wrong, okay. In her
The point
dissertation,
is she believed it, though.
no, but in her dissertation, she argues explicitly against the idea that logic is based in will acts. She argues explicitly against the idea that logic studies the laws of thought. It's more general. It studies the possibility of systems as such, the possibilities of metaphor as such, the possibilities of analogies as such. Okay, so this idea of rational will acts and the laws of thought is completely out for her, and she's getting that from Sheffer, I think.
And it's not Royce, but go ahead.
Okay, and this part I'm not allowed. That's all right. That's like bad hype about philosophy. Okay. Now, Russell, interestingly, writes these essays attacking James, saying that James is confusing belief and usefulness with truth. And he calls it the fundamental question of philosophy. And he develops a whole theory of truth for Principia Mathematica that is a correspondence theory. It's called the multiple relation theory of judgment. And every student of the history of early analytic philosophy has to look at this. It's like there's more written on this. And Wittgenstein convinces him there's something wrong. So there's a lot of arguments about the nature of truth. She herself says that she's applying Sheffer's ideas. So I have just a few moments. I'm going to say a little bit about Sheffer because I've actually done more work on Sheffer than I'm. Okay, here's Sheffer. Born in the Ukraine, Polish was his first language. He moves to Boston, went to Boston Latin School. He was sort of a genius with languages. He was known for that. He may have seen Peirce because Peirce came through and gave a lecture. Anyway, he studies with James, Royce, and Huntington, and he's regarded as the most mathematically sophisticated student in the philosophy department. So 1908 is the thesis. I'll talk about that in just a second. But like Langer, he was oriented toward transatlantic European sharing of ideas. This is very important about Sheffer. Sheffer kind of got stuck at Harvard. He couldn't get out. But he had this 1 year of a fellowship in 1910, and he did the grand tour. He goes to Cambridge the year before Wittgenstein arrives. The only extant notes we have of Russell's lectures are Sheffer's. That's how we know what logic Wittgenstein was taught the following fall. Then he goes to Paris, Turin, Burali-Forti, Göttingen, Jena. So he's worked with everyone. Russell, Peano, Padua, Burali-Forti, all the great names. Frege, Husserl. I think he probably met Husserl in Zermelo and Göttingen. And later he would correspond with Zermelo and work with Zermelo through his students. And there was a plan. Marvin Farber, who was an important American phenomenologist, was going to write a logic book with Zermelo. And Langer actually went to visit Husserl. She was in Germany in 1933. She tried to help them emigrate because Sheffer was hoping to get these logicians back. He was lonely. He needed help. So anyway, it was kind of a rough road because after he came back, of course, with all the anti-Semitism, he was and maybe his difficult personality as well, he was at a different place every single year. He just went on the road. There are fascinating notes of him teaching philosophy of science at the University of Missouri, incredibly comprehensive knowledge of all kinds of things, statistics, physics, Einstein. It's just absolutely amazing what he was teaching to these students at the University of Missouri. We have notes. He was in New York. He knew Emil Post was a friend. Post, simultaneously with touring, got the analysis of computability. He was an American logician who, again, took this touching down on strings very fundamentally. Post's metaphor was letterboxes. You have a worker. It was like City College. So it wasn't a human being with a pencil like with Turing. It was a set of letterboxes and he had to sort. But he got it. He got the analysis. Then he was at Michigan and then he came back. He was an instructor all that time, through the time of her thesis. Finally, he was made assistant professor the year after when Whitehead retired. So I think there was a huge push. I think the Jewish community of Boston had to pay for the chair. They had to raise the money. And I'm not sure he and Wolfson were the first two tenured Jewish professors at Harvard. So it was a big fight. Russell in his autobiography talks about writing all the time to Harvard. I mean, he publishes those letters to get back at Harvard. Harold Lasky. It was a problem. Now we have, somehow the right wing has figured out how to attack university presidents with anti-Semitism. But actually, there was a history at Harvard. So he had to leave in 1940 when Carnap came to visit. So he kept missing Russell. So Langer was really his tie. In his dissertation, and then I'll stop, he shot a general method of proving logical consistent, independent of any particular formalization of logic. So Langer, this idea that you don't rely on a notation and you don't rely on sentences. You look for pattern as such, Gestalt experience as such. This she's definitely getting from Sheffer. So what you do is you look at particular formalizations of logic and then you extract form and you look for commonalities of form. And it was very important that this was not free creation. You don't stipulate by a postulate what your mathematical structure is going to be. You have to find it in reality first. So it's an empiricistic view insofar as form emerges through actual interaction with experiences. And James had been his teacher as well. So I'll say in a moment what he did in terms of his analysis of constancy of form. He is the inventor of what is known now as neutral monism. That's in the thesis. He was a student of James. Neutral monism is this kind of almost spinozistic. It's like a double aspect view. And he gets it from James. The 1904 paper is Their Consciousness. So on this view, and I'm just going to have to skip ahead. Here's some of his stuff with algebra. It's just amazing. Oh, that's too bad. You can't see that. That's his, oh well. Okay. Neutral monism is the idea that there's all this stuff, let's call it experience. And knowledge is selection from experience. You organize experience. You extract from the flow of experience structures. So this is his idea. So his idea in the thesis is, first he's going to argue against all ineffable philosophies. His first paper was on the ineffable, and I'm pretty sure Wittgenstein read it, 1910. So she understands this ineffable stuff in the Tractatus because already Sheffer has been talking with her about that.
You realize that Royce spent half his life attacking that very view.
Which view?
What she's attributing to him.
Okay, or what I am. I mean,
Half
anyway.
of the first volume of The World and the Individual is an attack on exactly this.
Okay, so Sheffer is Russell's man at Harvard. That's who he is. He's a student of James. He's very close to James. So he sort of follows Royce's general view, but he's attacking. So he groups Emerson and Royce and mystical Hindu philosophers all together. Those are ineffable people, okay? He's logicizing philosophy. Okay, so this is an important moment on the way to Langer. Neutral monism, there's no ultimate substance. We select from the flow of experience via different postulate systems. And what he does is he goes to the physical, mathematical, and mental realms. And then we look for correspondences within system. So knowledge is pluralistic and aspectual, but it's never free creation. Okay? So this is a very interesting stimulus, I think, for her. He offered neutral monism to Russell at Cambridge in 1910. And Russell said no, he didn't like the form which this was offered to him. But by analysis of mind and analysis of matter, in 1926, 27, Russell thanks Sheffer. He reads the American Pragmatists. He gives up this multiple relation theory. Wittgenstein convinces him it won't work. And he converts to neutral monism. So Sheffer is the origin of this, and I think it's a very important strand of James and the whole idea of feeling and experience. Sheffer goes through various examples in the thesis of how this would work. But anyway, he's the one, the neutral realm. And he knows Russell's multiple relation theory. He subsumes that. And then the appendix is to refute Royce's claim to have produced a way to reduce all relations to symmetric ones. Okay, and the final thing he enunciates in his review of second edition of Principia is the logocentric predicament. Just as the proof of certain theories in metaphysics is made difficult, if not hopeless, because of the egocentric predicament, so the attempt to formulate the foundations of logic is rendered arduous by a corresponding logocentric predicament. In order to give an account of logic, we must presuppose and employ logic. So you have to have some system you're using to talk about systems. To avoid the arbitrariness of an imposed or stipulated conception, you have to make your clarification of what logic is independent of will acts or whims or anything like that, or conventions. She's totally against the idea, Langer, of conventions. Okay? So here are three things Sheffer suggests, three norms to avoid the logocentric paradox. First, assume the validity of logic, don't validate it. Just make explicit, at least in part, what we've assumed to be valid. Second, keep the study of structures and notations entirely distinct from the investigation of the loci of interpretations of a structure complex. So it's forms of forms. It's the system of systems. It's not about objects. It's not about concepts. It's not about ranges of concepts. It's about systems. Given certain configurations of printer's ink on paper or chalk marks on the board, we ask how certain forms, in quotes, are related to other forms. We also ask what there is in, quote, reality that may function as a locus for these forms. So he's with Frege and against Hilbert on Okay? And here he is. Finally, if we are to surmount the difficulties, and this I regard as indebted to Langer's thesis. If we are to surmount the difficulties created by the logocentric predicament, we must discriminate sharply between the problems of symbolic analysis, of notation and interpretation, and the study of the conditions that make that notational and interpretation phase significant and valid. In this subtle phase of logic, we have to inquire into the meaning of those very notions, class, relation, proposition, and so on, that are presupposed by the symbolic level. So I have lots more to say about her stuff, but I'll just quote her quickly on conventionalism. If logic is a gentleman's agreement or determination to be rational, it's conceivable that different cliques of gentlemen might sign different agreements, or that in a moment of weakness they might waver in their determination. I just love this. But a dissertation student, she's just amazing. But after all, it seems hardly plausible that validity of thought is determined by a social contract, subject to change through a majority vote among scientists, or by age-long habit that in the days of primeval slime, the law of contradiction didn't hold, so that the slime was both slimy and not slimy, and the same time was neither slimy nor not slimy. There's the Sheffer stroke. And the creatures who formed the useful habits of logical law were not the creatures who formed them. Just as all our thinking, or for that matter, all experience, is logical. So that's a remarkable statement. All experience is logical, because all experience has form. So we may say that all our experience is meaningful. The fact seems to be that meaning in its profoundest sense is one of the fundamental notions of logic itself. The only way we can express logical facts is through the employment of symbols, and it's the formal condition for meaning that makes the distinction between a mark on paper, which is a symbol, and one which is due to spilled ink or the murder of a mosquito. There it is. That's it.
Wow.
And I'm sorry about the Royce. I'm not an expert on Royce, so I have to read Randy's books.
I'm gonna give you a book.
Okay, good. The Royce is virtually impossible to read. Not for him. But it's brutal. Sheffer's tough, but one thing is her thesis is so much easier to read.
Was very well.
She tells you what she's learned in the classroom and learned from reading those books, and she puts this whole period together. So
Wow.
it's really remarkable. And once you get into the hang of what she's doing and you see how early the ideas are coming, you see sort of how she was able to do it. And that's what puzzled me at first, was how could she do this? I didn't understand. But she had the opportunity, and I think she's right to thank Sheffer, because I think Sheffer's ideas, and James through Sheffer, were very, very important.
Wow.
Okay.
Very quick.
Are you gonna come up and?
Yeah, I got it.
I mean, I could,
Why
but,
don't we start here and then I'll get the other question.
Just a quick, simple question,
yeah.
which you may or may not know. Is Langer's dissertation available on Journalist?
It's available on the Suzanne Langer Circle site.
Oh, okay. Well, simple enough.
And I am so happy if other people want to read it. I have been alone with this thesis since 1986.
I don't think that's
The
true.
annotated
People
bibliography, it's
have
fully
to-
annotated, the bibliography?
Well, she writes comments, not on every entry, but many of the comments
But
she writes.
that's all
very
part
well.
of the document.
That's part of the whole document.
Okay,
I've been
thank you.
there.
First of all, Whitehead retired in 1938.
Oh, sorry.
1927 was only his third year. So,
I confused that with the appearance of the meaning and symbol book.
yeah, symbolism.
And what I intended to do, thank you, I will fix the slides.
Which is largely misunderstood. Langer had a preference for that particular book of Whitehead's, and part of the reason she did is that she had a problem with what he did with it in 1929. You know, Whitehead's my main person, right?
I know, okay.
Okay, so,
But can I ask something? Because I have a conjecture, which you'll just tell me if I'm wrong. I mean, her thesis is 1926, and the meaning book is 27. I mean, they were talking, right?
Sure.
I mean, could she have had an impact on Whitehead?
I don't
That's
think
the
so.
question.
But I mean,
Well,
no.
Why do we not think so?
They were.
I would think so.
They were talking, but he wasn't listening. He never listened to them. And that's part of what frustrated her so much. Look, I've got a paper,
Okay.
I'll just send it to you.
Okay.
He never listened to her, and he should have. But anyway, so no, I think there's zero chance of that. But
Okay.
here's the thing. There are actually 3 or 4 other players in this.
Yeah.
For example, if I were to ask you the question, whose concept is the egocentric predicament?
Oh yeah, that's I'm sorry, I forget.
It's Perry.
It's Perry.
It's
No,
Perry.
it's
So
Perry.
that's Perry distorting both James and Royce and turning their disagreements into a simplistic refutation of Kant.
I get it. So
The
I didn't
logocentric
refer to him.
predicament never existed. Joel Skinner wrote a book about it because he was Sheffer's sort of apologist on this particular
Who?
point. Joel Skinner. It's in there. I'll show it to you.
All right, these are works of American
Yeah.
philosophy that I do know.
But anyway.
But I think logocentrism was an
But
important.
Royce is not a logocentrist at all. He's nowhere close. Nor is he some kind of Hindu mystic apologist. He spent half his life refuting that. The guy translated Sanskrit every day of his
Okay.
adult life with Rachman.
But
Rockwell.
still, the logocentric predicament for others at this time was
That's
huge.
Very influential.
That is true.
Huge.
That's how it
It's a
came.
good way to organize the problems about
It
me.
is. It just has nothing to do with Royce.
Okay.
And furthermore, the Sheffer stroke is not Sheffer's, it's Royce's. I have a
Peirce also. Peirce discovered it.
So look, the thing that's missing in your entire analysis is Peirce's place in all of
Yeah,
this.
exactly. And he may have had access to Peirce's papers
He
when he
certainly
came
did.
down.
He
We
certainly
don't, I mean,
did.
I'm not, maybe poor Sheffer, I don't know, but okay. But he still, in that paper, what is important is Sheffer is the way it came into Wittgenstein
That's fine.
and Russell. So Wittgenstein and Sheffer are like Jacob and Esau. Let's go back to the biblical story. They're the Jacob and Esau, you see, of Russell. They're the sons of Russell. They're the first two who Russell said, oh, just rewrite Principia. Yeah. These lectures at Cambridge are incredible. I mean, he gets up there and he's like teaching in Principian notation. I mean, think of what Wittgenstein and Sheffer were kind of faced with. So that's why I think Sheffer is important aside from neutral
Oh
monism.
no, he's important, and you're entirely right about the effect
Yeah.
in terms of the way it came into the philosophical discussion. I'm only talking about getting the text and the history right.
Well, Peirce had
And
the
they
stroke.
had, and Peirce and Royce were dead, effectively, and actually, and people could say about them what they wanted to, and they could ignore what they didn't want to read and pay attention to what they did want to read. If you pay attention to what was actually going on, you can find everything Sheffer did in Peirce and Royce.
Yes, this is well known.
Yeah,
This is,
okay,
I didn't
so-
want to deny.
Yeah.
Although the presentation is an application of the Boolean algebra and the Huntington.
But the Boolean algebra comes from Whitehead's treatise
It's
on
okay.
universal algebra, which Royce then,
Right,
he wrote
okay.
base system sigma
So I
on.
don't, so I don't want to deny
Okay.
any of all of
Well,
this.
that's the
We
way
had
it
to get
actually
to
happened, but
Langer.
the way people believed it happened is different. The way people believed it happened is the effect it had in philosophy.
I'm
and
kind
you're
of
right.
looking at this local, okay, the
This-
earlier time. And I do think her dissertation is useful for raising these questions about the
You aren't
earlier.
alone in that, nor have you
Yeah.
been since 1984
Good.
or 6. Right?
So then anyone who knows
No
more
one
than
other
I do.
person who has been reading the dissertation that long.
Good.
Who's
Okay.
that?
I
That's
see a
me.
hand up right
Yeah.
here. We'll
So
hold
just
this
to
one
say,
for-
no, just to say, here's what's important about this. I really don't know how to read Royce, but, and Peirce is a vast, I mean, it's wonderful,
I'll
but
give
it's
you a
just
book.
vast. But I think using her thesis to look at this as an ongoing tradition is very important.
Yeah.
And she is at the confluence, she's at a very interesting point in 26.
Agreed.
The 20s is a dark period in American logic, but a lot of important stuff went on. And then her role and Sheffer in being more cosmopolitan, in insisting on keeping those European connections going. This is kind of the shape. So I think we're in agreement that you want to look at this as an historical, a very important historical.
Yeah, I'm concerned with the correspondence theory. Is it truth, and what is the language position? Correspondence.
No, here I agree with Adrian. I mean, I think what he gets out of the Tractatus, it's not a correspondence theory of truth exactly, okay? Now, Russell's theory is a version of the correspondence theory of truth, this multiple relation idea. You have the idea, first of all, Russell wants to get rid of propositions. So he devises this theory because in his original view, a proposition was just bluntly true or false, and there's nothing you could say. So he wanted to have something to say. So the multiple relation theory is a theory about judgment facts. It's what's in Principia Mathematica. It's very interesting, and Gödel also studied this very carefully. He knew that Wittgenstein and Russell. You start with particular judgment facts. So Othello believes Cassio loves Desdemona is the example he constantly uses. Someone has a particular judgment, and that's a judgment fact, and the point is multiple because it's not a relation between a person and a proposition, which all of philosophy of language, which is hopefully coming to an end now, is kind of built on. It's not that simple.
You were just attacked.
No, he studies linguists, you know what I'm talking about. The multiple relation theory is it's a configuration, and there will be some kind of correspondence inside this complex, okay, between the mentality of the thinker. Now, you might say that Wittgenstein gets rid of the subject in the Tractatus. So there's not a self who's part of this configuration. And then we will be arguing for 100 years more, I suppose, is it a version of the multiple relation theory or is it not? I think I would sort of tend to say no. It's more of the structural picture that Langer has. So multiple relation theory is very important because you have a bottom-up characterization of truth. You get the distinction between truth and falsity right at the start. You solve your problem right there. And if you read Principia, it's almost like Tarski. You have these elementary propositions and you're going to build everything up, like the Tractatus. He calls them judgments of perception. Why? Because they're particular. The whole basis is they're particular, don't have quantifiers or true functional complexity. And because perception is a success verb. Notice, if it's a perception, then the thing is really there. So you don't study logic to figure out what is true, but you have to get the distinction between truth and falsity right at the basis.
Yeah, the reason why I am asking is that Heidegger divided the facts and the factical. Factical is more related with other things. So it is not clearly this is false and this is true because it's a factical and not fact.
There's facticity. I mean, the Heidegger thing is. Does she ever talk about Heidegger? This is a Langer question. It's really interesting. I don't think so. So that needs some. I mean, maybe it was his politics. She wasn't too happy with that. But anyway, this idea of unveiling and so on. In the phenomenological tradition, you're constantly also trying to get behind propositions. You're trying to break the hold of logic in imposing itself, propositional structures, on your experience. But the Langer algebra inherited from Royce via Sheffer way is a different way of not getting tangled up in the specific notation. Okay? You take things in immediately through the structure of the experience or painting. And then she says you have to abstract. And you may have to abstract several layers. But it's not unveiling the meaning of being because there are multiple points of view and we evolve and there are different ways of carving up and looking at a given experience. So her notion of symbolization and meaningfulness is that. Ultimately organic forms of life, which work symbolically. But by symbol, she doesn't mean a language necessarily. So I'm thinking that from Sheffer, she gets the idea, don't get tangled up in the notation. You have to surmount the limitations of the notation and think in terms of form and the possibility of structure. That's why it's logical. I mean, the key is why is this logic? But it's because logic deals with systems.
Yeah, he had the phrase notational relativity.
Yes, I had a thing from that. So the whole idea is he had this idea that you had to surmount the limitations. He thought this was very important, by the way, for Einstein. He thought the general theory of relativity, people get hung up on the axioms that the speed of light is constant and so on. But then with the general theory of relativity, if you look at any localized space, the world could be regarded as Euclidean. So he's thinking you don't want to get stuck in the idea that there is only one framework. This is the Jamesian background. There's multiple ways of creating form. And then you could begin to look at, how to structure, she calls it an analogy, or she'll analyze the notion of analogy or simile in terms of meaning. Like Wittgenstein does. Wittgenstein says in the Tractatus, all the pictorial similes of our language depend upon already our ability to project and represent. So she's taking that on. It's an amazing synthesis.
It sure is. Jeez.
I think that's a wonderful transition to dinner, maybe, huh?
Thank you very much. Thank you all very much.